Anyone who has an interest in disasters, or aviation history for that matter, has probably heard of the Munich air disaster of 1958. It's very well known, as the plane involved was carrying the Manchester United football team, journalists and club supporters who were returning to Britain after winning a European Cup match. However, in keeping with this channel's efforts to cover some lesser-known tragedies, we won't be looking at the famous Munich air crash. Instead, today's video looks at the other Munich air disaster, the one which occurred almost 3 years later and resulted in more fatalities, but which is a disaster that has been almost completely forgotten over the passing years. On December the 17th, 1960, a United States Air Force Convair C131 Samaritan was prepping for a routine flight from Riem Airfield, located just outside the German city of Munich, bound for RAF Northolt in southern England. The Convair C131 was a small twin-propeller military transport plane, able to be fitted out for small cargo or passenger flights. On board this flight were 8 crew and 12 passengers. The passengers were a group of American students who were studying at the University of Maryland Munich campus. The flight home was an unexpected treat for them, a chance to spend the holidays with their families, who were American Air Force personnel based in England. Major General Ernest Moore had flown from England to Germany for Christmas leave, and not needing the use of the plane over the holidays, he had allowed for it to be used to fly the students home. As the plane readied for takeoff on that cold, damp and foggy Saturday afternoon, the mood on board was probably a mix of excitement and high spirits, although there may have been a touch of nervousness as well. The news of a mid-air collision involving 2 passenger planes in New York City the day before may have soured the mood somewhat. Now, there appears to have been a slight delay in departure, as the pilots were apparently having some kind of trouble with one of the engines. However, it wasn't deemed serious enough to warrant the cancellation of the flight, and so, at 2:05 PM, the Convair C131 took off as planned from Riem Airfield. Almost immediately, it became clear that there was indeed a serious problem. An eyewitness report from the Times stated that the propeller on the left-hand engine slowed and stopped just after the aircraft left the ground. Trying to gain altitude and maintain speed with only one working engine, the pilot, US Major John Connery, radioed back to the airfield. "I'm having engine trouble, returning to the field." He also advised Riem Control Tower to prepare for an emergency landing and to get the airfield fire crews ready for a possible incident. Now, in order to get back to the Riem airfield, the C-131 would have to loop over central Munich, but the conditions for doing so were terrible. Thick fog obscured any view of the city. Flying blind and unable to climb out of the fog, Major Connery would have to use the cockpit instrumentation to navigate over the city centre. It was a tricky manoeuvre, especially with just one engine, and he almost made it. But that afternoon, luck was not on his side. As the plane circled through the thick fog above Munich, it headed straight for one of the only structures tall enough to be a danger, the 97-metre tall spire of St Paul's Church. In a terrible stroke of misfortune, the plane's left wing clipped the large cross at the very top of the spire. The force of the impact completely sheared off the left wing, and the stricken aircraft tumbled out of the sky, crashing just seconds later into a busy corner intersection of Landsberger and Martin-Griefstrasse, a commercial district which was packed that Saturday afternoon with Christmas shoppers. The devastation was immediate and terrible. Although the flight to England was only 2.5 hours, for some reason the plane had been fully fuelled before takeoff and was carrying 6,000 litres of aviation fuel, enough for 10 hours of flight. Upon impact, the aviation fuel ignited immediately, turning a 50-metre stretch of the street junction into an inferno. The impact also ruptured a gas main, which added to the ferocity of the blaze, and, to make matters even worse, a public tram filled with passengers was passing through the intersection just as the wreckage of the aircraft hit. The noise of a deafening explosion rocked the city centre, but in the dense fog, nobody knew what had happened. 32-year-old police officer Heinrich Munzert got a call through on his radio at 2:10 PM, stating that a petrol station had exploded on Martin-Griefstrasse. Arriving at the scene a minute later, he was still none the wiser as to what had happened, as all he could see was a huge wall of black, billowing smoke and lots of fire. Then he saw through the flames that a tram was ablaze and burning people were laying in the road. He and his colleague grabbed the nearest victim and rushed them to the nearest hospital. It was all they could do until more help arrived. 5 minutes later, the first firefighting brigades arrived on scene. Again, due to the wall of flame and smoke and the whole area being on fire, nobody was sure what the cause of the inferno. There were reports of a tram on fire, but that did little to prepare the firemen for the sight that greeted them. Nonetheless, the fire around the tram was quickly brought under control, but unfortunately, it was already too late for the passengers. There was only one survivor from the rear tram car, 18-year-old Manfred Hock, who was standing by the rear exit door. He was the last passenger to have boarded the tram. Hock, late for a dancing class, had sprinted fast to catch the tram as it trundled along the street. He thought he was lucky, being able to jump on board before it picked up too much speed, but just moments later, it was hit by the falling wreckage. Hock remembers a loud rumble, then a blast of heat so powerful that most of the passengers were rendered unconscious in an instant. Although the tram and everyone in it was ablaze, somehow Hock managed to open the rear door and leap out. Totally on fire, Hock managed to extinguish the flames on his body by rolling in the wet, slushy cobblestones and putting his wet coat over his head. He survived, but he was badly burned. Doctors later stated that he suffered severe burns over 40% of his body. As the fire crews brought the blaze under control, the telltale shape of the aircraft tail and wing became distinct, and the truth became apparent. This wasn't a petrol station that had exploded, or a tramcar fire. They were actually dealing with a plane crash. Fire crews from all over the city fought the blaze for the next 4 hours, finally putting out the last of the fires by around 6 p.m. The grim death toll was 52. All 20 people on board the plane had died, as well as 32 pedestrians and passengers. There were around another 20 or so victims hospitalised with serious burns. The mayor of Munich, Hans Vogel, was visibly moved at the sight of the devastation. He declared that it was one of the worst tragedies to have hit Munich in recent years, and it was made all the more poignant as just 2 days earlier the city council had held a meeting to get to grips with the problem of too many planes taking off and landing too close to the city centre. With all the air bases in the surrounding area, it's estimated that by 1960 there were around 1,000 flights a month which passed low over the city centre. With the gift of hindsight, it seems like this was an accident just waiting to happen. The burnt-out remains of the tramcar were covered in a tarpaulin and removed to a secluded location where the fire brigade had the grim task of removing and trying to identify the bodies. The final tasks of the Munich Fire Brigade were completed the following day. They still had to safely remove the severed left wing of the C131, which was stuck in the roof of a house about a kilometre from the crash site, and they had to remove debris from the church tower and secure the cross, which had almost been knocked off the top of the spire when the plane hit. A few days after the crash, a civic funeral was held for the victims. The coffins of the local victims were accompanied by one empty coffin draped in the American flag, symbolising the 20 American victims of the tragedy. The remains of the students had been flown back to England for the harrowing task of identification by the parents. 3rd Air Force Deputy Superintendent Tom Drysdale remembers that awful day. The students' bodies were then airlifted to a large room at the rear of the 3rd Air Force building. Appropriate Air Force personnel and chaplains escorted the parents of the students to the back room to identify their sons and daughters. For Clarence and me, it was a terrible experience. We tried to be helpful and consoling, but it was awful to witness the distraught, crying and grieving parents going to and coming from that back room. All of the students who died were aged just 17 to 19 years old. Young lives and bright futures snuffed out in an instant. In the wake of the 1960 Munich air crash, the authorities decided to abandon plans to expand Riem Airfield. After this disaster, there was no justification for even more air traffic over the city centre, and so the site for a new, larger airport was chosen, but far away from Munich city. Air crash investigators determined that the ultimate cause of the crash had been that a small amount of water had contaminated the aviation fuel. Being heavier than the fuel, the water had sunk and collected at the bottom of the tank and made its way into the fuel line, where it froze solid. This prevented fuel from reaching the left-hand engine, a fact which only really became apparent once the C131 was airborne. Why the plane had been fueled to capacity with enough fuel for a 10-hour flight was something that was never explained. Tramcar survivor Manfred Hoch underwent 36 skin graft surgeries over the following years, living in almost constant pain. To cope, he began drinking heavily. But luckily for Hoch, one of the nurses looking after him in the clinic, Nurse Barbel, was there for him. In his own words, he says, "She really pulled me up out of the gutter." Not long after they met, they were married, and they still are to this day. A simple plaque at the location of the crash remembers the 52 victims of the 1960 air crash, a tragedy which became known as the Black Saturday of Munich. On the 3rd of March 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981, a fully loaded McDonnell Douglas DC10 airliner, crashed minutes after the takeoff from Orly Airport, Paris. All 346 people on board were killed, and at the time it was the worst air crash on record. It later transpired that another DC-10 had suffered an identical accident just 2 years earlier, but had managed to land without serious incident. However, warnings went unheeded, and 2 years later the flight of Turkish Airlines 981 would end in death and disaster. During the late 1960s, 3 airline manufacturers were in competition to dominate the booming air travel market: Boeing, Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas. While Boeing looked set to be the leader of the pack with the iconic 747 already in the air, McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed were scrambling for second place, both looking to produce a mid-sized jet to fulfill the proposal from American Airlines for a 300 to 400 seater which could take off from regular runways. Lockheed announced it was building the L1011 TriStar to fulfill this demand, and in response McDonnell Douglas announced that it would be launching the DC-10. McDonnell Douglas, suffering financial problems and desperate to stave off bankruptcy, declared that the DC-10 would beat Lockheed's TriStar to market, and it would be a better plane to boot. McDonnell Douglas lived up to their claim, and the first DC-10s were put into service in August of 1970, almost 2 years ahead of Lockheed. However, in the rush to be the first company to get their planes airborne, had McDonnell Douglas compromised on safety. On March 3, 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 from Istanbul touched down safely at Paris's Orly Airport, making a brief stop before continuing on to its final destination of London. Orly Airport was in a state of chaos that day, as British BEA workers had gone on strike, causing massive disruption and passenger delays all across Europe. Stranded passengers were being reseated on any available flight back to London. Flight 981 was mostly empty after the Paris stop, and in a terrible twist of fate, took on an extra 215 passengers who would normally have been travelling back on other planes. After a short delay boarding the extra passengers, Flight 981 took off just after midday for the short 1-hour flight to London. The first few minutes of the flight were uneventful, and the plane climbed normally, heading towards its cruising altitude of 23,000 feet. Suddenly, as the plane reached around 12,000 feet, it was rocked by a violent explosion. The rearmost 2 rows of seats were sucked straight through the cabin floor, and the 6 passengers sitting there were blown out through a hole in the side of the fuselage. The pilots, Captain Nejat Berkots and First Officer Oral Ulzman, had no idea what had just happened in the back of the passenger cabin, but what they did know was that the airliner was suddenly out of control, diving towards the ground. The desperate struggle to control the falling plane was captured on the cockpit voice recorder. Berkots. What happened? Ulzman. The cabin blew out. Berkots. Are you sure? The plane yawed violently to the left and began diving steeply. The plane is diving so fast that the airspeed warning begins to sound. The plane will start to break up in midair if it goes much faster. Burkotts, bring it up. Pull her nose up. Ullisman, I can't bring it up. She's not responding. Nothing is left. 7,000 feet. Burkos, it looks like we're going to hit the ground. Speed. The plane is now going so fast that the nose begins to lift of its own accord, hence the cry of speed from Captain Burkotts. Ullisman powered the engines in a last-ditch effort to gain altitude, but it was no use. In the final few moments there's only silence as the pilots desperately try to pull up the nose of the doomed airliner. At 12:41 PM, just 70 seconds after the explosion, Flight 981 ploughs into the trees of the Ermenonville forest at nearly 800 kilometers an hour. Smashing through the forest for almost a kilometer, the plane and everybody on board disintegrate into thousands of fragments. All 346 people are killed instantly. Emergency services rushed to the scene, but it was immediately apparent that this was not a rescue operation. The plane, its passengers and cargo were scattered over 65,000 square meters, torn into thousands of unrecognisable pieces. Only the engines, an odd wheel, and a small part of the fuselage remained identifiable as having come from an aircraft. Of the passengers, only 20 victims were able to be identified as intact bodies by the rescue services. The macabre clean-up process began. Hundreds of thousands of plane fragments and an estimated 20,000 body parts are collected by the rescue service personnel and volunteers. A very grim task indeed. It's quickly established that not all of the wreckage is in the Ermenonville forest. The rear cargo door, some luggage, and the rear 2 rows of seats containing 6 victims are found some 15 kilometres away in a field outside a village called St. Pathos. The initial cause for the crash had been discovered. The rear cargo door lock had failed, resulting in an explosive decompression in the cargo bay. This in turn collapsed the cabin floor above, dragging the seats and the 6 passengers down and out through the wide open cargo door. But why had this caused the plane to crash? The plane was still intact with engine power and it had a functioning crew. The reason was that the control cables to the rear tail rudder, the rear engine and flaps all ran through the floor where the rear seats were located. As these seats were torn through the floor, the control cables were severed. From that point on, the pitch of the plane became impossible to control and all aboard were doomed. It was a series of events that could lead to a total loss of an aircraft, and what made it worse was that McDonnell Douglas knew all about this problem, and instead of fixing it, had tried to skirt around it to save costs and reputation. During the design phase, the DC-10 had been given an outward opening rear cargo door in order to maximise space for cargo inside. And the problem with outward opening doors is that the pressure inside the aircraft works against them. The higher the plane goes, the more pressure is exerted against the door, trying to force it open. They need a very secure locking mechanism to prevent an explosive blowout. And you could make a whole video about the door lock mechanism and why it failed, but suffice to say that the overly complex design they came up with was not only likely to fail under certain conditions, but it also had a problem that the door could appear to be locked and safe when in fact it wasn't. It was possible to have a situation where the lock had not fully engaged, and yet there was no warning light on in the cockpit, and the baggage handler who closed the door from the outside would have no idea that the door wasn't locked properly either. Nobody would know until it was too late. This potential to lose the whole aircraft had shown itself during ground testing back in 1970, when the aft cargo door blew out, collapsing the floor and severing the control cables to the tail. Now, instead of rectifying this potentially fatal flaw, McDonnell Douglas simply blamed human error. They insisted that the door hadn't been closed properly by the test operator. However, the obvious and deadly design flaw was just ignored, as it would cause too much delay and cost to undertake a redesign. Then, in 1972, a DC-10 flying out of Detroit suffered explosive decompression as the rear cargo door blew out at 12,000 feet. In an almost identical series of events, the rear cabin floor collapsed and the plane lost control and began to dive. Luckily for the 67 people on board, the exceptional skill of the captain and the first officer in using the engines to steer allowed for a very risky emergency landing. A fatal crash had been narrowly averted, and importantly, the NTSB investigators had a clear picture of what happened and what was needed to fix the problem. The NTSB report recommended urgent modifications to the cargo door locking mechanism and additional venting inside the cabin to prevent the floor collapse. Unbelievably, the FAA didn't mandate these changes, but instead relied on a promise from McDonnell Douglas that they would deal with this in-house and in their own time. Now, McDonnell Douglas did send out some service advisory bulletins asking airlines to make the modifications to the door lock, but in reality, not much changed. Some DC-10s continued to fly with the same fatal design flaw. The plane involved in the Ermenonville disaster was fuselage number 29. This was one of 6 DC-10s sold to Turkish Airlines in late 1972. The cargo door modifications had not been undertaken on this plane. Somehow, the missing work had been signed off by McDonnell Douglas inspectors as completed. In the rush to get the planes in service for the Christmas period, corners were cut. The handover from the McDonnell Douglas engineers to their Turkish counterparts was rushed and chaotic. There was language confusion, missing service manuals, poor maintenance facilities. They all made for a rough handover. Somewhere in all this confusion, somebody accidentally bent the locking rod on the aft cargo door, and then added metal shims to the switch contacts on the door, so that the warning light in the cockpit would turn off after the door was shut, even if it wasn't closed properly. A poor design had just been made so much worse. It's incredible that Turkish Airlines managed to fly this plane for 15 months with this jury-rigged cargo door, but any luck they had had ran out for 346 people on March 3rd, 1974, in the skies outside of Paris. In the initial aftermath after the crash, McDonnell Douglas again tried to blame human error for the cause, insisting that the baggage handler at Orly Airport must have been to blame. However, the FAA's failure to implement the NTSB recommendations soon came to light, and the press covering the disaster made sure that all these failings came to the public's attention. Pretty soon, the idea of safety concerns being brushed off to save reputation and money, shady backroom deals, and gentlemen's agreements had become fixed in the mind of the public. The expose of a memo showing McDonnell Douglas were well aware of the potential for a major catastrophe due to the cabin floor design, then put this whole saga into the realm of criminal negligence. McDonnell Douglas faced multiple lawsuits from families of the victims in the largest ever action filed against a civil aviation company. After attempting to blame everyone but themselves, McDonnell Douglas finally settled out of court for a sum equivalent to about $500 million in today's value. The NTSB recommendations were finally mandated by the FAA, and the aft cargo door design flaw was finally fixed. Although this would not be the last crash involving a DC-10, never again would people die due to the failure of the rear cargo door. During the research of this topic, it became clear to me that it's impossible to lay the blame for this terrible accident at the door of just one person or one single company, because there were failings all along from all sides. The FAA officials who refused to mandate the changes, the airline executives who, in a bid to save their company, ignored the dangerous design flaw exposed during ground testing, the people responsible for jury-rigging the cargo door, the original aircraft design, the fuselage builders who knew that the rear cabin floor was dangerous, the inspectors who signed off on the work which never had been done. All of these factors came into play on that fateful day, 12,000 feet above the outskirts of Paris. There is a memorial to the victims of Flight 981, accessible on foot, deep inside the Ermenonville forest. It's often visited by the families of the victims of the tragedy. Even today, people walking in the forest are still finding fragments of the doomed airliner in the undergrowth. Tiny reminders of the tragedy that took place here all those years ago. To some extent, the physical and mental scars of the disaster still remain today, and probably will for years to come. The first flight to the South Pole, or should I say the first flight that actually landed at the South Pole, was a customised US Navy R-4D Skytrain called the K-Sarah, which landed at the geographic South Pole on October the 31st, 1956. The crew of that plane were the first people to stand at the South Pole since the Amundsen and Scott expeditions of 1911. Now, incredibly, that same year, 1956, saw the very first sightseeing flight to Antarctica. This flight, originating from the southern Chilean city of Punta Arenas, took 66 tourists on a 9-hour round-trip flight which passed over the Antarctic regions of the South Shetlands and the Trinity Peninsula. These first pioneering tourist flights continued sporadically throughout the late 1950s, but it wasn't until the development of more modern airliners with longer ranges that Antarctic sightseeing tours became feasible for anyone other than the Chilean national airline. Now, as early as 1968, Air New Zealand had mooted the possibility of offering sightseeing trips to Antarctica. However, the decision was made to wait until they had a new fleet of DC-10s available before offering this service. DC-10s, with a much longer range, could make the 12-hour return trip without needing to land and refuel. Spurred on due to public demand and from Australian airline Qantas's announcement that they would be starting sightseeing trips, Air New Zealand made its first Antarctic sightseeing flight on February 15, 1977. From the get-go, it was clear that these would be no ordinary flights. All passengers would be treated to first-class service, including a champagne breakfast, 5-star gourmet lunch, and an open bar. As souvenirs of their flight, passengers received limited edition maps and brochures. The aircraft was intentionally underbooked to ensure that there was plenty of room on board for the tourists to move around and to get those great views out of the windows. On top of this, each flight provided a guide in the form of an Antarctic expert. He was there to provide commentary and was on hand to answer any questions. And these guides included some high-profile names, like for example Sir Edmund Hillary, who, apart from his conquest of Everest, was also famous for his expeditions across Antarctica. These sightseeing flights also differed dramatically from regular flights in one other important aspect, and that is that they would fly much, much lower than normal, as, after all, they were sightseeing flights. But just how low they went is surprising. The big DC-10 airliners would descend to altitudes of just a few hundred feet in order to give the tourists some great close-up views of the scenery speeding by below. Now, this might sound reckless, to say the least, but if visibility was good and the pilot competent, there wasn't any inherent reason why a plane of this size couldn't fly at this level. Indeed, during the sightseeing flights of 1977 and 78, flying at this very low level had occurred many times without incident. Air New Zealand flight TE901 was the last scheduled Antarctic sightseeing flight of the 1979 season. Just 4 flights had been organised for 1979, all happening in November, and they were all fully booked within days of being announced. The last flight of the season was set for November the 28th and would be piloted by Captain Jim Collins. This would be his first and tragically last Antarctic flight. The November the 28th flight was scheduled to leave Auckland just after 8 in the morning, but it was delayed for some minutes after a female passenger demanded to leave the aircraft before it took off. Although feeling oddly apprehensive about the flight, she eventually reboarded the plane after being assured by Air New Zealand staff that the Antarctic flights were indeed safe and that there was nothing to worry about. The initial part of the flight was uneventful. It was just a long haul over the Southern Ocean towards the Antarctic landmass, but as the DC-10 neared the coastline, it descended down to around 10,000 feet. By now the DC-10 was in communication with air traffic control at McMurdo, the American research station which is located at the southern end of Ross Island. McMurdo Air Traffic Control advised the crew of the DC-10 that there was a layer of overcast cloud at around 2,000 feet, but clear underneath. If needed, they could provide radar-assisted descent for the crew. As the airliner descended by making 2 loops, one to the left and one to the right, the flight crew informed McMurdo that they'd spotted a gap in the cloud and that they would continue down visually. This was at around 12:42 p.m. At 12:45, the crew radioed McMurdo to inform them that they were already down to around 6,000 feet, visually heading for McMurdo, and would be continuing the descent down to about 1,500 feet. On board the DC-10, most of the passengers were by now pressed up against the windows, cameras in hand, getting ready to snap away at the majestic and unspoilt wilderness which would shortly be passing just a few hundred feet below them. In the cockpit, Captain Jim Collins engaged the navigation system to lock back onto the track, which would take the plane down the middle of McMurdo Sound. This gave great views to Ross Island and Mt Erebus to the left, and the icy valleys and the peaks of Victorialand to the right. Ahead, Collins could only see a blank white vista, but he wasn't worried. At any moment, he would certainly see details of the landscape emerging as the plane continued downwards. Suddenly, the ground proximity warning blared into life.
Terrain, pull up, pull up.
Pull up, pull up. Collins reacted immediately, applying maximum thrust and pulling back hard on the yoke, but it was way too late for evasive action. A couple of seconds later, the DC-10, with 257 people on board, ploughed straight into the lower northern flank of Mt Erebus, killing everyone on board instantly. This grainy photograph showing fuel or hydraulic fluid spraying onto the window came from a passenger's camera recovered from the wreck. It's likely that this person had their finger on the shutter, ready to take a photograph when the crash occurred, and we can only assume that at the exact moment of impact the button was pressed, unintentionally capturing the haunting final moment of Flight 901. The first sign to the outside world that something had gone very wrong was when the DC-10 failed to check in again. McMurdo Air Traffic Control had been expecting a radio call from Flight 901 every 10 minutes or so, but instead they heard nothing. Despite repeated calls from McMurdo, there was just an ominous silence. Within the hour, they'd sent out spotter planes to check the route of Flight 901, but they could find no trace of the airliner. McMurdo then informed the authorities in New Zealand that contact had been lost, and when the DC-10 failed to appear in the skies above Christchurch by 7 o'clock that night, authorities had no choice but to list the plane as overdue. As word spread, anxious New Zealanders tuned into the TV and radio, hoping against hope that the plane would somehow miraculously reappear. But by 10 o'clock that night, and that was past the point that the DC-10 would have run out of fuel, Air New Zealand CEO Maury Davis went on TV to announce the sombre news. Fuel reserves were exhausted approximately half an hour ago. The aircraft has to be down. Due to the long summer days of Antarctica, the McMurdo search crews were able to carry on looking throughout the night, and at around 1:30 in the morning, a streak of black debris was spotted at around 1,400 feet on the lower slopes of Mt Erebus. Flight 901 had been found, and the morning papers led with the story. The DC-10 had crashed onto the slopes of Mt Erebus, and there were no apparent survivors. For search and rescue teams, Flight 901 would prove to be an especially arduous task. In order to get any idea of why the plane flew straight into the side of a 12,400-foot volcano, which should have been clearly visible right in front of them, they would need to recover the black boxes from the site. But conditions at the crash site were awful. Blizzards, lack of shelter, high winds and sub-zero temperatures all made the business of recovering the remains of the passengers and the black boxes much more difficult than usual. A team of New Zealand police officers were flown out to the crash site to begin what was known as Operation Overdue. The words of Inspector Jim Morgan described the frozen hell that the men found themselves in. We all spent about a week cramped in polar tents amidst the wreckage and dead bodies, maintaining a 24-hour work schedule. We split the men into 2 shifts and recovered with great effort all the human remains at the site. Many bodies were trapped under tons of fuselage and wings, and much physical effort was required to dig them out and extract them. Initially, there was very little water at the site, and we only had one bowl between all of us to wash our hands in before eating. The water was black. In the first days on site, we didn't wash our plates and utensils after eating, but handed them on to the next shift because we were unable to wash them. I couldn't eat my first meal on site because it was a meat stew. Our polar clothing became covered in black human grease. All bodies and body parts were photographed in situ by US Navy photographers who worked with us. Also, US Navy personnel helped us lift and pack bodies into body bags, which was very exhausting work. We felt relieved when the first resupply of woolen gloves arrived because ours had become saturated in the human grease. Later, the scuba gulls began eating the bodies in front of us, causing us much mental anguish, as well as destroying the chances of identifying the corpses. We tried to shoo them away, but to no avail. We then threw flares, also to no avail. Because of this, we had to pick up all the bodies' parts that had been bagged and create 11 large piles of human remains around the crash site and bury them under snow to keep the birds off. It was immensely exhausting work. After we'd almost completed the mission, we were trapped by bad weather and isolated. At that point, I allowed the liquor that had survived the crash to be given out, and we had a party. Macabre, but we had to let off steam. As the weather cleared, the helos were able to get back, and we then were able to hook the piles of bodies in cargo nets under the helicopters, and they were taken away to McMurdo. Due to the efforts of the men of Operation Overdue, it was possible to positively identify over 80% of the body parts recovered from Mt Erebus. The burnt-out wreckage, too much to recover and too difficult to remove, was left where it was. It remains there to this day, and, weather permitting, it's occasionally still visible on the lower north flank of Mt Erebus. The black boxes were recovered intact, and the task of working out exactly what had gone wrong began. Now, no one thought this was going to be an easy task, but on the other hand, I don't think anyone at the time had any idea of just how controversial these findings would prove to be. I'll admit that even having read through the story of the inquiry several times, I'm still not entirely sure of what conclusion can be reached. I'll be posting a much more detailed summary of my findings on the Patreon page, but for this video I'm going to keep this as short and simple as possible, so bear with me as things from here on in get a bit complicated. The official inquiry into the crash of Flight 901 was headed up by New Zealand's Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, a man called Ron Chippendale. Using the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, as well as an abundance of photographic evidence from the cameras of the doomed passengers, he came to the conclusion that ultimately pilot error was to blame for the crash. The Chippendale report confirmed that there had been no error on the part of the nav computer, the waypoint coordinates had been entered correctly, and the flight plan had been followed correctly. In his summary, Chippendale came to the conclusion that the pilot had intentionally flown below safe limits, whereupon he'd become the victim of an optical illusion, a phenomenon known as a visual whiteout, where the sea ice, the cloud and the sky merge into one sheet of continuous white. This prevented Captain Collins from seeing the lower flank of Mt Erebus, even though it's right in front of him. Unsure of where the plane actually was, the crew as a whole had failed to take adequate measures to ensure the safety of the aircraft, and the result was the catastrophic loss of Flight 901. The blame for the deaths of 257 people lay squarely with Captain Jim Collins and his flight crew. Now, at around the same time that the Chippendale report was published, a second parliamentary inquiry got underway, headed up by Justice Peter Mahan. In what would prove to be a bombshell report, the Mahan inquiry was to reach an entirely different conclusion altogether. Mahan's report highlighted some things which had either been overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant in Chippendale's paper. Most importantly was the fact that the coordinates for the nav track for Flight 901 had been altered the day before the tragic flight. Now, various explanations for this were put forwards, from correcting a typo in the original plan to altering the flight plan to satisfy some bureaucratic map review that was coming up shortly. But the key thing, though, was that no one informed the senior flight crew of this change of plan. The route that they'd been previously briefed on was no longer the same route that the nav computer would be following. They thought that they would be flying directly into McMurdo Sound, but the new route had them flying directly over Mt Erebus. As to the idea that Jim Collins was flying recklessly by being so low, well, everybody knew that it was common practice for these sightseeing flights to drop down to 1,500 feet or even lower. There were many existing photographs which proved this, and there was much eyewitness testimony from previous flights about the clarity of the landscape as the aircraft descended to these levels. I mean, after all, low flying and close-up sightseeing, these were the main selling points for the whole Antarctic experience. Captain Collins wasn't flying in any way that other previous flights already hadn't done, and Air New Zealand knew this perfectly well. I mean, some of their own upper management had been on these flights and had written glowing internal memos about the experience. Their pretense that this low-level flying was something that, they knew nothing about was plainly ludicrous. Also, a key factor in Chippendale's summary was the fact that the crew must have been uncertain of their position. But again, that didn't seem to fit with the evidence. On the cockpit voice recorder, the crew appear composed and confident just prior to the crash. Conversations between the pilot and the first officer don't indicate any sense of being lost or being unsure of their position. Muffled conversations in the rear of the cockpit, which were difficult to make out, seemed to have been transcribed in a way that made it appear that the crew were lost. Again, evidence seems to have been twisted to fit the theory. As Mahan dug deeper, other disturbing evidence appeared. Eyewitness accounts of Air New Zealand staff frantically gathering up papers and files and shredding evidence on the day following the crash. Important documentation went missing from the homes of the deceased captain and the first officer. The captain's logbook, recovered from the crash site, was handed into the inquiry with pages torn out. The whole thing just stank of a cover-up, and when Mahan released his findings, he didn't hold back. The palpably false sections of evidence which I heard could not have been the result of any mistake or faulty recollection. They were very clearly part of an attempt to conceal a series of disastrous administrative blunders, and so I am forced reluctantly to say that I had to listen to an orchestrated litany of lies. In his opinion, Air New Zealand had known all along that the most probable cause for the crash was the last-minute alteration to the nav track, an alteration which somebody forgot to mention to the crew. So when Flight 901 took off that morning, the 28th of November 1979, it was already doomed. In order to avoid paying out millions of dollars in compensation, Air New Zealand had desperately tried to cover this up. So on the one hand, the Chippendale report blamed the low-level flying of the flight crew, acknowledging that the nav track change was there but dismissing it as irrelevant. And then on the other hand, Mahan's findings pointed to an entire cover-up of the whole thing by Air New Zealand. It was a disastrous blunder which had doomed the airliner from the start. And as you might expect, the whole thing became a highly charged political football. The New Zealand Prime Minister publicly admonished Mahan for his findings, but as he had friends and relatives on the board of Air New Zealand, the parliamentary opposition took full advantage of this glaring conflict of interest. Air New Zealand's CEO, Maury Davis, refused to resign, but ultimately he was forced out by the board. Now, he received death threats and was regarded as a pariah by the general public. Mahan became like a public hero. He was seen as the one honest judge who was willing to fight for the truth, to fight for the families of those who'd been lost. The whole affair ended up in the High Court, where 5 judges ultimately sided with Air New Zealand. They argued that Mahan's findings of a cover-up were outside of his remit. In other words, even if he was right, well, it was none of his business. Peter Mahan, having been publicly admonished by the courts, resigned a broken man. He died in 1986, and his famous report was never officially recognised by the New Zealand government. Air New Zealand never flew to Antarctica again. 40 years later, in 2019, the New Zealand government apologised for its role in the affair, but there was no new evidence and there was no clarification as to who was really to blame. The mysteries of Flight 901 refused to go away. Even to this day, the case is hotly debated on online aviation forums. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, a solitary cross in the snowy wastes of Antarctica stands as a marker, a memorial to the 257 people who lost their lives on the frozen slopes of Mt Erebus all those years ago. On June 2nd, 1978, Japan Airlines Flight 115 suffered an accident when coming into land at Osaka's Itami Airport. During the final approach to the runway, just as the plane was touching down, the pilot pitched the nose of the huge Boeing 747 up too steeply. This caused the tail of the plane to hit and scrape along the runway. Fortunately, the 747 was able to complete its landing on the runway successfully, and although the plane had suffered substantial damage to its rear end and some passengers had been injured, a major incident had been avoided. However, what seemed at the time to have been a lucky escape would go on to have terrible consequences. This botched landing would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the deaths of 520 people on the slopes of a forested mountainside some 7 years later. The Boeing 747 in question had been built in 1974, a special version of the standard 747 that was specifically designed for Japan's crowded short-haul domestic routes. To us in the modern day, it might seem crazy using a super jumbo for short-hop domestic flights that weren't even an hour long, but the number of passengers flying between Japan's 2 largest cities, Tokyo and Osaka, necessitated the use of such huge planes. This was especially true during the Obon Festival, when Japanese families would return to their ancestral homes to pay homage to their forefathers. So this plane was very much in demand, making numerous short-haul flights day in, day out, year in, year out. The accident during the landing at Osaka caused extensive and severe damage to the rear section of the fuselage, but being only 4 years old, the plane had lots of years of service left in it. So the decision was made to repair the plane and not to scrap it. Now, there's nothing untoward about this decision made by Japan Airlines. There's no reason why, with the correct repairs, this aircraft couldn't keep flying until the end of its service life. The problem was that someone made a crucial and ultimately fatal error when carrying out the repair work. Now, the tail strike had caused extensive damage to the tail section, but possibly the most difficult aspect of the repair work was the repair of the rear pressure bulkhead. This is the structural division between the pressurised part of the aircraft, that's where the passengers and the crew are, and the unpressurised rear section of the aircraft. On this plane, the bulkhead was shaped a bit like a half dome. It's like a shallow soup bowl that's been turned on its side. The whole thing was made from aluminium segments that were riveted together and reinforced with steel stiffeners. Now, during the landing at Osaka, the impact had crumpled to the lower part of this bulkhead, and for some reason the decision was made not to replace the entire thing, but instead just to replace the lower damaged half. However, when it came time to fit this new lower section of bulkhead, it became apparent that on one side the overlap was a bit narrow. There was only enough room to place 1 row of rivets where 2 rows were needed. So to solve this problem, the Boeing ground team that carried out the repairs used a splice plate in the middle, a third plate to which both sections of the bulkhead could be securely riveted. Now it's at this point that a truly horrendous error was made. In order to fit the splice plate around the stiffener, the team cut the plate into two, and they riveted two separate sections to the bulkhead instead of one continuous plate. The result was that the upper seam was, in effect, still only attached with one row of rivets that were taking all the strain. Now, this seemingly obvious error somehow went unnoticed. By the time the bulkhead repairs were inspected for approval, the whole area had been caulked in sealant and the flawed repair had been hidden from view. But the rear pressure bulkhead now had a hidden weak link. It was like a ticking time bomb. And if that weak seam ever failed during a flight, it would certainly end in catastrophe. Okay, so fast forward 7 years to August the 12th, 1985. And 3 days before the busy Obon Festival, and the 747 is loaded with 509 passengers and 15 crew. 524 men, women and children, excited and ready to make the short flight from Tokyo's Haneda Airport to Osaka. Now, during the intervening 7 years, this 747 has made over 12,000 of these short-haul flights. That means over 12,000 depressurizations and repressurizations, which have been slowly but surely weakening the row of single rivets in the rear bulkhead, weakening them to such a degree that many little hairline cracks are now visible in the splice plate. Little hairline cracks which haven't been picked up during the routine visual inspections that the plane underwent. So, you have the botched landing 7 years earlier, the flawed repair on the bulkhead, and the visual inspections which have failed to pick up the telltale signs of failure. And now the passengers and crew of Japan Airlines Flight 123 were about to pay the ultimate price for these mistakes. Captained by 49-year-old Masami Takahama and accompanied by First Officer Yutaka Sasaki and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, Flight 123 took off just after 6 p.m. on August 12, 1985, looping over Tokyo Bay and heading out over the Gulf of Sagami, flying west towards Osaka. It's just another short hop, regular flight between the two cities with nothing seemingly out of the ordinary. But 12 minutes into the flight, as the airliner was passing above Oshima Island at an altitude of around 24,000 feet, the rear pressure bulkhead failed and Flight 123 suffered a catastrophic decompression event. In the space of just a few thousandths of a second, the rivets on the weakened seam ripped apart and a massive wave of pressurized air blew the bulkhead apart like a blown out tyre. The effect was like a small bomb going off in the tail section as the pressure wave tore through the tail cone, destroying it and blasting shrapnel in all directions, severing hydraulic control lines in the process. The pressure wave literally ripped the huge tail fin to pieces. The pieces then disintegrated and tore off completely. Inside the cabin, passengers heard a loud bang and the air suddenly filled with white mist as the moisture in the cabin air condensed. Napkins, newspapers, magazines, they all rushed through the air towards the rear of the plane as the cabin depressurized. The roof of the rear passenger toilet block caved in and daylight could be seen through a large crack in the rear fuselage. One can only imagine the terror and panic on board as the air masks dropped from above and the huge aircraft began swaying and bucking in a sickening and violent motion. In the cockpit, the flight crew had no idea of what had happened, but they definitely felt the explosion and they heard the bang. Captain Takahama requested an emergency return to Haneda Airport, which was granted, but he quickly realised that they were in dire straits, as First Officer Sasaki cried out that the 747 was not responding to his inputs, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda confirmed that they'd lost all hydraulic pressure. The awful truth was that the flight crew were no longer in control of the aircraft. The blast had severed most of the hydraulic lines in the rear of the plane, meaning that as well as having no rear rudder or tail fin, the remaining control surfaces were now no longer operational. The pilots only had control of the engine thrust. They couldn't turn or control the pitch of the aircraft. Despite the damage, the plane remained airborne. It began to enter a sea-sickening roller coaster ride of ups and downs, while simultaneously swaying left and right, as it wove its way north towards Mount Fuji and the hilly inland area of Honshu Island. This horrible, nightmarish rise and plunge must have caused terror beyond belief for the passengers, who by now must have been aware that the plane was completely out of control, with little to no hope of making a landing, and yet they remained airborne, zigzagging and lurching through the sky above the mountains of Japan. After about 15 minutes of this horrible motion, the 747 did a full 360-degree spiral, pitching down, losing about 8,000 feet of altitude just south of Mount Fuji. Terrified passengers would have seen the mountain looming just below them, the plane seemingly heading straight for it, before coming out of the loop and then seesawing northwards again. Witnesses on the ground could see the plane swaying and lurching, obviously in distress, and somebody managed to snap a blurry picture of the doomed jet, clearly showing the missing tail fin as the giant plane staggered on through the sky. In the cockpit, it was a lose-lose scenario for the flight crew. If they tried to dampen the roller coaster ups and downs by alternating the engine thrust, it exacerbated the swaying motion, and vice versa. Captain Takahama and First Officer Sasaki had little to no options left open to them. All they could do was try to use what limited control they had left to keep the crippled behemoth airborne for as long as possible. Terrified, possibly suffering from lack of oxygen, the flight recorder indicates that none of them tried to put on their oxygen masks, the men struggled heroically with everything they had to try and get back on course to the airport. But any and all efforts were to be in vain. 32 minutes after the bulkhead failure, the doomed airliner, which had now dropped to 5,400 foot of altitude, clipped the top of a forest ridgeline, flipped upside down, and pancaked into the opposite slope 500 metres away on the other side of the valley. Captain Takahama screamed, "It's the end," just before the doomed airliner struck the hillside and exploded in a huge fireball. With debris and fire spread out on the mountain, it wasn't long before the first aircraft made a pass over the crash site. The United States C-130 altered course, and just 25 minutes after the crash, that's around 7:20 p.m, located and reported the coordinates to the Japanese authorities. A nearby US airbase offered a chopper and crew to go straight to the site and do a reconnoitre, but the Japanese authorities refused the offer. At this point, things take another tragic turn. Upon hearing of the complete devastation at the crash site, and possibly influenced by one of the C-130 crew who said over the radio, "I doubt there'll be any survivors," the Japanese authorities decided to muster all recovery teams in the village of Ueno, which was the closest village to the crash site, but then told them all to wait and to set out at first light. The terrain was steep and difficult, and assuming there were no survivors, it seemed to make sense to wait until daybreak to begin the recovery operation. During the night, helicopters flew over the crash site, now plainly visible as it burned in the darkness. What no one knew at the time was that there were in fact survivors, many of whom would die during the night as the rescue teams assembled and waited in the valley below. The Japanese government had assembled hundreds of rescue vehicles, thousands of firemen, rescue workers and policemen. Also available were helicopters and spotter planes. But the first people to actually reach the crash site were about 160 rescuers who had trekked up the valley from Ueno village, setting off at dawn and arriving at about 10 in the morning. It was like a vision of hell. The fires were still burning, bodies and twisted debris littered the hillside. There wasn't much there that resembled any part of an aircraft, the impact had been so severe. Making a search of the impact zone, the rescuers realised that as the aircraft smashed into the slope, the end part of the tail section had sheared off and had tumbled down into the adjacent valley bottom. And it was here that, amazingly, they found 26-year-old Yumi Ochiai, badly wounded and trapped, but still alive, some 16 hours after impact. Nearby, hanging from the branches of a tree, was 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami, and she was also alive. Rescuers soon found 30-year-old Hiroko Yoshizaki and her 8-year-old daughter Mikiko, wounded but again alive. Hope surged as the rescue team frantically searched the remains of the tail section, but that was it. 4 survivors. Just 4 people out of the 524 that were on board. The aftermath of the crash of Flight 123 was marked by shock, grief and sorrow in Japan and around the world. There's something particularly horrible and chilling to me about the fact that it stayed airborne for so long. That horrible, out-of-control motion must have made most passengers aware that the plane was completely out of control, that there's going to be no emergency landing, there's no chance of avoiding a crash. And can you imagine what that must have been like, being on there with your family? It's the stuff of nightmares. Many of the passengers, aware of the dire situation that they were in, they wrote goodbyes to their relatives on napkins, bits of paper, in notebooks, scribbling saddening, tragic last words to be read by loved ones after they'd died. These were just ordinary people, knew that they were living their final moments on board that horrible, doomed aircraft. One of the 4 survivors, Yumi Ochiai, described the moment of the crash during an interview from a hospital bed. There were 2 or 3 strong shocks. Sheets, cushions and other objects around me flew into the air. Seats fell on top of me and I couldn't move. My stomach hurt so bad it felt like I was going to be torn to pieces. I was pinned between seats and I couldn't move. I saw a helicopter and I waved, but it didn't appear to see me. Now, she also stated that there had been many other people in the tail section who did indeed survive the initial impact. She said she heard panting and gasping noises from many people, and she heard other survivors talking to one another and a young boy trying to find his mother. However, by dawn the next day, all these survivors were dead. They'd succumbed to their injuries after spending the night on the mountainside without any aid or shelter. Incredibly, the official report into this disaster makes no mention of this eyewitness testimony, instead declaring that all 520 victims of Flight 123 perished at the instant of impact. Not surprisingly, this finding proved contentious, with many relatives of the victims crying foul at this seemingly blatant cover-up of the authorities of their mistake of waiting for up to 12 hours before setting out for the crash site. In fact, the whole investigation seemed bogged down in bureaucracy and infighting, with air crash investigators being kept away from the scene by local police who, unbelievably, initially insisted on taking charge. It took a month of inter-agency wrangling just to get the wreckage removed from the mountainside. The 332-page report into the crash of Japanese Airlines 123 also failed to answer the most pertinent question of all. Why had the repair to the pressure bulkhead been so badly fudged? The report just skipped this question, leaving many people unable to get a satisfactory answer as to the question of exactly who was to blame. Was it Boeing, or was it actually more the failure of Japan Airlines? To this day, nobody really knows for sure the exact role each party had to play in the disaster. In the wake of the tragedy, some at Japan Airlines certainly blamed themselves. The CEO resigned, and 2 senior maintenance workers committed suicide in order to repent for the mistakes made by the company. If you add them to the death toll, it gives 522. It was, and remains to this day, the worst single aircraft disaster in history. And just a couple of points in closing. Firstly, some of you might be thinking that this all sounds very familiar. If so, you might be thinking of the crash of the Turkish DC10 outside of Paris back in 1974, where explosive decompression cut through the control cables in the tail of the plane, and that caused the death of all 346 people on board. One of the takeaways from that disaster was the need for a pressure release door in the tail to avoid exactly this scenario of the total loss of control due to the control lines being severed. Well, the 747 had one of these doors, but whether it malfunctioned or whether it was sealed shut, Nobody knows. No answer has ever been given as to why this failsafe didn't work. And secondly, several experienced aircrews have recreated this scenario in flight simulators to see if there was any possible way that the crew of Flight 123 could have landed the plane. Even in just simulation conditions, without being terrified out of your mind and being oxygen starved, none of them have ever managed to land Flight 123 successfully. In fact, many crews have expressed only the deepest admiration for Captain Takahama, Officer Sasaki, and Engineer Fukuda for being able to stay airborne for as long as they did. Ultimately, anything the crew tried could only delay the inevitable. Flight 123 was doomed from the second that the bulkhead ruptured, and there was nothing anyone could do to change that fact.
But first, just 4 minutes after takeoff, the planned fly-past at the Absheim air display. To begin with, the low-level pass with undercarriage down went smoothly. But then, the moment when the crowds realised something was seriously wrong. They could clearly hear the twin engines screaming as the captain desperately tried to gain height. Oh la la!
Oh yeah!
Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! Oh no!
I can remember seeing this footage on the TV news all those years ago, and I can clearly remember thinking that this seemed like a completely unnecessary crash. To the untrained eye, it looked as if the pilot just came in too low, too slow, and basically misjudged everything and flew the aircraft straight into the forest that was right in front of him. Having now researched this accident to make this video, I can confidently say that my opinion hasn't changed all that much. Yes, there are a couple of mitigating factors, but long story short, the pilot flew his brand new Airbus, loaded with passengers, right into the middle of a forest. The aircraft in the video is an Airbus A320, and it was performing the first ever passenger flight of this model of aircraft. On board were 130 passengers and 6 crew. The passengers were a mix of reporters, there to cover the maiden voyage of the A320, and a group of lucky winners who had won tickets for this promotional flight after taking part in a raffle organised by local businesses. The date was June the 26th, 1988, a warm, clear Sunday, a day that would remain etched into the memories of everyone present for all the wrong reasons. The plan for that Sunday was for the A320 to leave Paris's Charles de Gaulle airport for a short flight to Basel Mulhouse airport, where the passengers would board the plane for a sightseeing tour around Mont Blanc. However, having collected the passengers for the sightseeing trip, they were first scheduled to perform a quick low-level flyby at the local Hapsheim airstrip, as they were having an air show that day, and having the Airbus do a low-level flyby over the runway would undoubtedly be the highlight of the event. The day was dubbed as an aerial baptism for the A320, but I don't think anybody expected it to be a baptism of fire. Piloting the A320 were captains Michel Asselin and Pierre Mazières. Asselin, the senior man in the cockpit, was very much involved with the introduction of the A320 into the Air France fleet, and was a vocal proponent of the modern electronic fly-by-wire system that was incorporated into the new plane. Although Asselin had only picked his aircraft up from the factory 2 days previously, he had flown other A320s before. He was an ex-Air Force pilot and conducted many test flights of the A320 for Air France, pushing the plane to its limits. He probably had more experience of flying the A320 than any other pilot, and he was fully convinced of the plane's abilities and of his own abilities as a captain. Asselin seems to me to have been the kind of pilot that revelled not only in his job, but in the kind of macho image that came along with it. Apparently his nickname in the company was Rambo, and here in these publicity shots for the A320, he clearly looks every inch the handsome debonair pilot, as much at home doing adverts for Patek Philippe watches as he is sitting in the cockpit. At this point, it's worth noting that this flyover would be the first time that either man had laid eyes on Habsheim airfield. They knew roughly where it was in relation to Mulhouse, so Asseline's plan was to take off, simply fly around at 1,000 feet following the motorway north towards Mulhouse itself, and then when they spotted Habsheim airstrip, they would make a visual approach, descend to 100 feet, extend the flaps, lower the landing gear, pull the nose up to the max, and give the watching crowd a spectacle that they would not forget. Apparently, Captain Mézières was somewhat sceptical that this manoeuvre could be pulled off safely, but Asseline assured him that the A320 was up to the job, and told him not to worry, as he had already pulled this stunt off at least 20 times before. Now, maybe that was true, but if it was, he neglected to mention that half of those had been performed in a simulator, and the other half over large empty runways where he could maintain a much higher airspeed. I think it's also worth noting at this point that there were 2 attractive female passengers in the cockpit who had been invited up there by the pilots to have the best view during the sightseeing tour. Now, it may be that Captain Asseline might have felt the need to appear confident and cool-headed in front of the ladies, or maybe not. Maybe this guy just really thought that he was such a great pilot and he knew he could pull this stunt off no matter what. Anyway, with any doubts about Asseline's flying ability having been firmly quashed, at 2:40 p.m, the A320 took off for Habsheim airstrip. At 2:24, Captain Asseline spotted the airfield and began the descent down to 100 feet. As they got closer, he noticed that the crowds of spectators were not lined up along the main runway, but were in fact massed along the side of a shorter grass runway which intersected with the main one. He dropped the engines to idle. He turned the A320 to the left to line up with a grassy runway. Mézières had extended the flaps and dropped the landing gear, and as the Airbus continued to drop towards the runway, the robotic voice of the terrain warning system chimed in the cockpit. Terrain, pull up. Followed by the altimeter reeling off the current altitude. 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet. Watch out for those pylons ahead. You see them? Said Mézières. Asseline blithely replied, Yeah, don't worry. 40 feet, 30 feet. Asseline finally pulled the A320 out of the descent. They were too low. They were way too low. The engines were at idle. The nose was pulled up to the max and the plane was a whisker away from stalling. But this was exactly the stunt that Asseline had wanted to perform. A super low-level flyby with the nose pitch high at low speed. And it was at this point that Captains Asseline and Mézières noticed that there was a large forest directly ahead of them. Asseline cranked the engines to the max, but it was way too late. There was simply not enough time for the engines to go from idle to getting up to giving enough thrust to get the plane to ascend. Captain Asseline, no pretense of his cool head remaining, yelled out one word. And the spectators watched in disbelief as the brand new A320 gracefully ploughed its way straight into the treetops before disappearing from view. A couple of seconds later, a huge fireball erupted from the forest as the plane crashed into the ground. Incredibly, and I do find this incredible, at that point of impact, nobody had been killed. All 136 people on board survived the initial impact, but the right wing had sheared off. Burning jet fuel had sprayed all over the place, and the passengers were now in imminent danger of being burned alive inside the wreckage. Most of the emergency exits were inoperable, either leading directly into the path of the raging fire or being blocked by twisted foliage. Around the middle of the plane, some windows had broken and the floor had split open, and a wall of fire now divided the cabin. In the rear, passengers were able to calmly evacuate by the rear door, but in the front section, passengers scrambled in panic, pushing and shoving to reach the only available exit. This panic was completely understandable. The cabin was rapidly filling with thick, black, toxic smoke. One woman was screaming and shoving as her hair and her clothes were on fire. The only way out was partially blocked with splintered branches, which tore at the fleeing passengers who screamed in panic and pain as they tumbled out from the burning aircraft. but due to the professionalism of the cabin crew, almost everyone made it off alive. Almost everyone. Hervé Leerman, a 14-year-old quadriplegic boy who was unable to call out or move, was missed in the scramble to escape. 7-year-old Mariama Barry had been trapped by her seatback and was unable to do her safety belt. Her little brother had tried to free her, but he was swept away in the crush. Marie-Françoise Freuch, realising that a little girl was still trapped, ran back on board to try and find her, but she was overcome by smoke and collapsed. All 3 victims died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Due to the difficulty in reaching the crash site quickly, because it was in the middle of a forest, the Airbus A320 was almost completely consumed by the fire. Only the tail and the left wing remained intact. Nonetheless, 133 people from the 136 on board escaped with their lives. Seeing that crash footage, it's nothing short of miraculous that so many people managed to walk away from that fireball with just mostly minor injuries. The inquiry into the crash of this Airbus A320 was of massive importance to the European aerospace industry. If it was concluded that the aircraft was at fault, this would have devastating consequences for Airbus. The A320 was one of the first generation of fly-by-wire aircraft, which basically means that computers interpret the pilot joystick input and remotely control the flight surfaces of the plane. Now, this not only did away with the need for routing of mechanical systems, pulleys and wires and hydraulic piping, but it supposedly allowed the computer to fly the aircraft in a perfectly safe manner. For example, that might be something like overriding a joystick input from the cockpit, which would cause the plane to stall. So if it turned out that the onboard computer had prevented Captain Asseline from taking necessary evasive action, then the whole fly-by-wire process would have to be scrapped. On the other hand, if it was shown that pilot error had been the cause, then Airbus was off the hook and, wouldn't go bankrupt. After months of scrutiny of all the available data and running multiple real and simulated test flights, the result was in. There was nothing wrong with the plane. The fault lay squarely with the flight crew. Basically, they were not prepared to do that low-level flyby. In the view of the investigation, Asseline and Mazieres had made several errors of judgment. Having spotted the airfield too late, they had to drop the engines all the way down to idle to get down fast enough. Then there was the last-minute left turn to line up with the grassy runway. Their failure to properly recon the site meant that they had no idea that the forest was there. Captain Asseline took the A320 well below the minimum 100-foot level stipulated for the flyby. The investigators thought this was probably to show off to his female guests in the cockpit. And they did not leave enough time to get lift thrust from the idle engines. The pilot's behaviour that day had been almost reckless and showed overconfidence combined with poor judgment on the day. Captain Asseline was furious. He broke off all cooperation with the inquiry and went on TV claiming to be the victim of a cover-up. He was a scapegoat. The plane was the problem, not him. If the A320 would have allowed him to pull up more steeply, the crash would have been avoided. The engines didn't give him the thrust when he needed it, and so on and so on. It seemed that Air France's standard bearer for the A320 had suddenly become its biggest critic. In fact, the A320 did override Asseline's joystick input to pull up sharply, but this was only because that move would have caused the airplane to stall, and it would have pancaked into the forest, probably killing many more people in the process. In the end, all of Asseline's protestations did him no good. He, along with Pierre Mazieres and 4 other officials, were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Most received suspended sentences, but Asseline, bearing the brunt of the blame, got 6 months in prison. He boldly declared that he would fight this judgment in France's highest court of appeal, which he did, only for them to increase his sentence to 10 months in prison. And this time around, he had no avenues of appeal. He did his time. He was stripped of his pilot's licence, and as far as I know, he never flew for Air France again. I don't think that there's much to be said in his defence, but there were some contributing factors that were not Asseline's fault. Air France had failed to give him adequate information about where the crowds would be at the Hapsheim airfield. The forest wasn't marked on his chart, and he was given no opportunity to recon the airfield for himself prior to the day of the flight. Nonetheless, to perform such a risky, unprepared manoeuvre with a full load of passengers on board is, in my view, unforgivable. It's in my own opinion, but it seems to me to be a clear case of pilot hubris that resulted in senseless and completely unnecessary accident that claimed the lives of 3 innocent people. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was the aircraft that actually was to blame, and Asseline was in fact just an innocent scapegoat. It's possible, I guess, but somehow I doubt it.